Well, good afternoon again, folks. Welcome again to our webinar this afternoon, our last one of 2020. A look back at 2020 and what some of the things that it brought to us. There may have been something good in the year. We'll try to find it. Today, we're working with Grayhair software on presenting the webinar. And before we start, I want to make sure that we cover some ground rules here. The first is that today's webinar is being recorded, and that, of course, to keep things calm, all lines are being muted in the presentation. If you have a question, please feel free to type something in the chat box or the question box, and as best we can, we'll answer those questions and comments during the program or at the end. A recording of the webinar will be available to our subscribers as soon as it renders and is available for them shortly afterwards. So with that in mind, I want to make sure that we go over today's today's discussion points. Angelo's on here with me.
Hi, Leo. So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about some of the major events in postal that happened in 2020. We'll talk a little bit about the new Postmaster General and some of the initiatives and how they affected the election and just mail volumes and mail delivery in general. We'll talk at the end a little bit about what to expect for next year and how these changes are going to impact mailers. We'll talk about like the 10-year review and some of these other things. All right, next. All right, in case you didn't hear us, I'm Angelo Anagnostopouplos, Vice President of Postal Affairs at Grayhair Software, and Leo. Leo, I can't hear you.
Oh, here we go. Now can you hear me better?
Yeah.
There's a little bit about us and about our what we each do, and how I'm learning to not push the mute button at the wrong time. So with that in mind, let's see here. We want to go over some things today having to do with the Postal Service and some changes that it's been going through over the past few months. So go ahead, Angelo. You want to cover these?
Sure. So the first thing we wanted to talk a little bit about is the new Postmaster General, Louis DeJoy. He's the first external Postmaster General since Marvin Runyon, I think back in the early 90s. And so it's pretty interesting to think about that, because after Marvin Runyon they have all been insiders. And so, when the outsider came in, some people were saying, what is he going to do? Is he going to dramatically change the Postal Service? And we did see a little bit of that. On the governor's side, Governor Williams resigned just before the new Postmaster General. And there were two new ones added, and there's one that's nominated by President Trump. We'll have to see if that gets approved prior to the end of his tenure at on January 20th. We'll have to see what happens there. As far as the Postal Service itself, I did mention that the Postmaster General, did shake things up a little bit. He did split up operations basically into two parts: retail and delivery, and processing and logistics. And those are headed up by two different vice presidents. Some of the areas were also realigned. So some of the areas that we were used to have been, some of them have been combined, and there's less areas. And the interesting thing too is there's a different set of areas for retail and delivery versus processing and logistics. So you kind of have to look at the maps. Now, what that's doing is it's changing, who the individual VPs are for the different areas. It's a smaller number, and some of them have real large areas, like the Western and Pacific area is a pretty large area to cover. So we'll have to see how that shakes out, and we'll have to see what that looks like from a reporting perspective. We're still waiting for the Postal Service to give us kind of the 3-digit lists on what these things look like so that we can put that in our visualizations. And more to come. You know, we don't know what other kind of realignments and changes are going to happen. One of the things that we wanted to highlight is what happened with the IT side of the organization within the Postal Service. So what happened is they split up the IT organization into 2 different groups. One called Application Technology, which encompasses all of the things you see in parentheses there, and then Network and Compute Technologies, which is the other side of the organization. So they've split that up into more defined functions. All right, next, Leo.
There we go. Whoops.
Oh,
there we go.
And as part of that, some other areas changed. And another one we wanted to highlight, which was just recently announced a couple of weeks ago, was the reorganization of the Mail Entry and Payment Technology Group, which, you know, all of the mail service providers and a lot of the mail owners interact with. Some of the functions that used to exist under the old MEPT group moved under the IT organization. And what you see below that are the 2 org charts for the CIO and for the Chief Customer and Marketing Officer parts of the organization. And what you see in yellow are where the legacy MEPT groups fell into. So you could see that, you know, some of that now is under Tom Foti and some of that is under Mark McCreary within those 2 respective sides of the organization. We'll have to see what happens because now you have 2 different organizations that have to communicate with each other. And as you know, we've seen in the past, there have been some challenges in that. Hopefully they're kind of working through some of this and figuring out how to work together and making sure that we're getting as an industry what we need. All right, next.
Oops, I have a very twitchy mouse today.
All right, so switching topics, we want to talk a little bit about volume declines. A lot of that spurred on by the pandemic. And so what you see here is a chart that shows where some of the more heavier impacted industry segments were. So as an example, if you look at from the bottom up, you see from the more affected to, you know, the least affected. And so you see like finance and insurance, retail and trade, professional and scientific services and things of that nature were heavily impacted, meaning that, you know, they didn't mail as much. And then there were some other areas like public administration and some others which actually had a reverse effect. They had some increase in volume throughout the pandemic period. And so, you know, if you listen to the Postal Service, they're saying that, you know, they're planning for 2021 to see a sustained decline of about 15% in mail volume as compared to this year, which was, you know, a little bit above 20%, not including parcels, of course, because parcels are doing very, very well. I think they're up 40% right now above same period last year.
And I would suspect that some of the declines, like in finance and insurance and things, are in the discretionary types of mailings, promotions, ads, you know, buy my stuff, so, you know, join my bank, join my credit union. But the things that are not discretionary, like billings, statements, annual statements, whatever, those are still going out because those applications were not changed because of the pandemic. So that's one asterisk we might want to add in there, is that this is probably all discretionary mailing, not things that are required by normal business practice or statute or something else.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Leo. I mean, almost all of the volume decline was in marketing mail for those particular segments, and very, very little to none in the you know, transaction or first class type mail.
And my guesses would be, if they broke this down, you'd see a lot more severe drop in flats than in letters.
Yep. Yeah, and we'll be talking about that a little bit later when we start to talk about the 10-year review and the impact that's going to have on flats.
So let's see here. Let's go to the next slide. Right. Get the mouse to cooperate. let's see. Let's see. Please, mouse. Thank you. Oh,
Nope, one too many. So one of
there
the
we
things
go.
that last MTAC and at every MTAC quarterly meeting, the Postal Service shows what their service performance is. And just for reference purposes, quarter four is the Postal Service's quarter four, which ends at the end of September. And you could see, and there was a lot in the news, you probably heard around vote by mail, which we will also be talking about. But yeah, there was a lot of concern because of mail volume, performance, and you could see that for quarter four, performance for first class letters and flats was severely down from the prior year. If we look at the next slide, we could see that the same picture exists for marketing mail. So service for most of this year was pretty bad. Let's go to the next slide. And as you can see, periodicals was the worst affected of all. I mean, their service for the fourth quarter was at 74%, which is dramatically lower than 88, which isn't even comparable to what you would see in like first class and marketing mail.
Looking at some of the numbers that came out in quarter four, I know there were some numbers that hadn't been reached, I mean, in a negative sense, for several years, and some were just the worst in a long time. But what's important to understand in these three slides here is that there's the word composite. Not so much in periodicals, which is pretty much entirely flats. But if you're looking at first class and particularly standard, or I'm sorry, marketing mail, you've got a real aggregation of some parcels, but a lot of letters and flats and different levels of sortation. And if you look at the numbers that are produced and presented to the PRC quarterly, and you dig into them, you can see a wide range of performance figures between the more efficient types of mail, automation letters and marketing mail, destination entered stuff, compared to the less efficient things like origin entered flats. So what you see here in each of these three slides is a very high level number, beneath which you've got a much broader range of figures showing how service for some products, if you will, was abysmal or not so bad, depending how you want to look at what you're interested in.
Yeah, I mean, like you look at first class mail and, you look at letters versus flats. Letters, a lot of times, 2, 3, 4, 5 days, the stuff is there. You got to add another 5 days for flats because they don't typically do as well. In marketing mail is another really good example. I mean, if you origin enter something, service is much worse than if you were to drop it at an SCF as an example.
Right. And I think you're going to see that manifesting itself even more in the quarter one numbers, which will be concluded at the end of this month and published sometime probably in mid-February or a little bit later.
Yep. All right, next slide. So one of the things that we threw in here, the Postmaster General put in some initiatives in June to try to have the trucks leave on time, to try to curtail overtime where it wasn't necessary, and basically to have the Postal Service run more like a clock than to have them wait around for mail that was still coming off of machines and that. And what you see in this slide is you see the effect of that, and this was throughout the month of July. Service went down dramatically, and this is really the reason why you saw Congress calling the Postmaster General in front of them and having them testify, and you saw a lot in the news around mail delivery, and you saw a lot of anecdotal information, not only anecdotal, but real information that mail delivery started to suffer just because the way that the Postal Service is, they can't really just turn on a dime. Some of this stuff has to be done a little bit more gradually, and you have to do a lot more analysis before you could just start implementing some of these programs. So the question is this coming back? Because the Postal Service was required legally to stop this and put everything back to the way it was, because of ballot mail that was going to be going through the system, making sure that all of the states received all the ballots back on a timely basis. And you'll see what happened. You know, it's a kind of a good news story there. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit.
And of course, like, you know, anything else, this chart shows a very high level number. If you look at some of the details that were disclosed because of court orders that directed the Postal Service to produce very granular, or for them and for what's usually publicly disclosed, relatively granular data week by week by district. You can see that this is not a situation where one size fits all. You had some districts that were good performing districts that really had very little decline in performance, that were poor performers already who had a really bad summer. You also saw that situations came and went as absenteeism came and went, as schedules were adapted or adopted, I guess, that more aligned with processing routines. So a lot of what's here is the struggle to get old practices aligned with how things should be done, and how that went badly or went well, depending where you look.
Yeah. No, Leo, there's a couple of questions in the before we go to vote by mail. There's a couple of questions in the
Let's see
box.
if I can.
So
Yeah.
I'll just address them real quick. So the first one is just to talk about, you know, that these things may get much worse, and they could, you know, especially if the Postal Service starts to implement some of the cost-cutting measures that they had started to implement in mid-June. And then the other comment, which is quite true, especially due to COVID, right now I think the Postal Service has 15,000 people out in quarantine because of COVID, which is a pretty big number. And during the height of COVID, around April, May, you know, around that time frame, there were certain districts in certain areas that had very, very poor service performance. I mean, as an example, Detroit, they weren't able to touch mail for almost a period of 2 weeks just because they had so many people out. So there's places around the country that were adversely affected, especially the New York, New Jersey area that had sustained problems for a very, very long period of time. So again, you know, to reiterate what Leo said, when you look at these numbers, you know, they're just aggregate type level numbers. In some areas of the country, it was much worse. I mean, in Philadelphia, there were some people that didn't see mail for 30 days, you know, as they were, you know, they were complaining. So, you know.
And of course, as we mentioned before, there's a situation where there wasn't a uniform problem in all districts. That we ran numbers, some of the extracts from some of the court-ordered detailed performance numbers. We ran them in the newsletter over the summer, and it was really a situation where, as Angelo just mentioned, you know, absenteeism took hold, and you had problems with processing operations. Not everybody ran their processing operations the way they should have, so you had inefficiencies in transportation and so forth. So a lot of factors were taking hold over the summer, including a jump in parcel volume. And depending how adeptly a district or its plants or an NDC or annexes were able to manage this changing situation, you saw numbers that were better or worse for performance district by district. And even at that level, districts did not always perform the same with different types of mail. So it's very deceiving to say that, you know, mail service was X% in July or August. It's much more accurate to look at Detroit or Cleveland or New York and see how they were doing because of how circumstances affected them, particularly compared to, pick somebody else, Tennessee, who may have had a whole different set of circumstances.
Yep. All right. You want to cover this next part, Leo?
Okay. Vote by mail. I don't think anybody needs to be told that it was the largest turnout in history for mailed voting activity, and that overall the Postal Service did a much better job than some of the media reports would have you believe. Of course, going into the election, there was a certain number of people who were convinced that, you know, that the Postmaster General was going to be jumping in mailboxes, burning ballots on you. But that none of that turned out to be the case, and the very, very high percentage of ballots made it on time with very little problems. Of course, there were some situations where employees were involved in various activities that were not in line with the responsible actions of a postal employee, but that was a very small minority, and fortunately had no real effect on the outcome of the voting. There were, I don't know how many judges' orders delivered in different parts of the country in response to concerns of various states or public action groups. And those judges' orders imposed all kinds of requirements in the Postal Service, and not everything that they ordered made sense. So not everything they ordered was followed, including sweeping bins at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on sorters, particularly when that activity would not normally be done at 3 o'clock or didn't align with transportation schedules. But by and large, all of that has come and gone. Now, the one thing we do have is probably a much greater interest in using the mail for voting among the states and other jurisdictions than we ever saw in the past. Just as we're all learning to work from home, I think the states are all learning how to manage voting by mail. So with that, as you'd expect, there is a growing amount of interest to create a separate class or product, if you will, to enable, pardon me, much better focus on just what this thing is that is called election mail or campaign mail or ballot mail, and put a little bit more structure around it so we don't have the variety of local actions and interpretations that we saw in some situations earlier this year. Let's see here, click along on my little mouse. There it goes. Oops, too far. Let's see, there it is. So over the period of the election activity and the balloting, you can see the numbers. There was a lot of it. 4 billion pieces of political mail and 610 million pieces of election mail. And there is a difference as far as the Postal Service is concerned between these two things. And of course, you had the ballots themselves going out to voters and being returned. And the vast majority got to where they had to go and got back again on time within an average of 2.1 days, according to the Postal Service. So there is based on this a record of success, I guess you could say, in conducting a very stressful year's elections in a format and through a venue that was not something with which most of the people who were involved in voting were familiar. A lot of people in election boards all over the country had to learn how to do vote by mail. And as anybody in the commercial mail production business knows, the volume of mail that they were working with was essentially while making huge bulk mailings, and they not necessarily were familiar with how to produce such things. That was part of the challenge, of course, that it was faced by all involved. The Senate race is the one place we still have some activity, and that's in Georgia. And of course, that's ongoing, but I don't think we'll hear the kind of hue and cry that we heard for months during the national election. This is just one residual piece, and I think by now they figured out how to run balloting by mail. So going into next year, Angelo?
Yeah, so one of the things that's happening is we have a new administration that's coming in, and so that presents some different opportunities, from a Congress perspective. So Biden will be adding 3 governors and replacing an additional 4 during his term. So that could dramatically change the way that the Board of Governors is comprised. Because one of the things that people ask us is, can Congress fire the PMG? Well, no, they can't. Only the Board of Governors can. Now, once Biden changes a bunch of them, maybe they'd be a little bit more receptive to do that. But they're the only ones that have authority to do that. Also, Biden will be replacing 4 out of the 5 commissioners within the PRC. And when we say replacing, they could re-up those terms, or they could bring in somebody new, depending upon what they want to do. There's going to be a new Treasury Secretary, and based on who he has nominated. She is a lot more friendly, towards the Postal Service than the existing one. And I know there was a comment put in the questions around some of this funding, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but there are going to be some effects based on a new Treasury Secretary. What the impacts of all of this is, it's still unknown. We'll have to see as this unfolds to see what kind of impact this is going to have on us. Okay.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about what could happen, and as Angelo said, it's a matter of educated guesswork. The first question that I keep getting is the PMG going to stay? Well, the few times that I've had a chance to hear from him and talk to him, it's pretty clear that he looks at the kerfuffle of the couple of months when he first came on board as being past him, as being behind him, and that he is interested in staying for the long term and making some significant changes in how the organization operates. His background being in logistics, I think, is something which gives him confidence to make changes in how operations conducts itself. And as you've already seen, he's very interested in making things very efficiency. He likes talking about precision. He likes seeing things done the way they're supposed to get done. So to the extent that there was a need to tighten up how operations ran, then this is something which we may expect him to look at more strongly than he might look at softer issues. Although I think his willingness to find new ways to generate revenue might mean he's interested in finding out more about products and pricing as well. So yes, he will be staying, and I think he'll be looking at a lot of things that have been perhaps not fully considered in the past. Let's see here. Cost-cutting efforts. Yes, cost-cutting efforts will continue. There were, as the number I saw once, something like 55 different initiatives to change processes to become more efficient, quote unquote. None of those were probably bad ideas, but they were probably badly timed by being implemented last summer. And they were not well explained to anybody. So, for example, you saw mailboxes disappear. And in some cases, that was simply a matter of taking them out to put a stronger box in so that somebody couldn't drop a match in it. It was harder to fiddle with the mail. The machines that were taken out that people interpreted as being actions to hurt the movement of ballot mail, those were machines that were probably scheduled for removal for months, because the drop in volume of letter and flat mail made them superfluous. So you're going to see such things continue. Is there going to be better study in the future? I would hope so. Anybody who remembers the network rationalization process of 5 or 10 years ago remembers how there was a lot of criticism of the Postal Service because they didn't do studies which eventually proved to be not thorough enough, and that therefore their actions did not yield the kind of results that were expected. So doing a better analysis of what you're going to do, of the impact of your actions, is hopefully something that they will be sure to do in the future. Relief, the latest package is supposed to give the Postal Service $10 billion with no strings attached. But of course, we've had packages go through before that were supposed to have money for the Postal Service that never did make it to the final act. Angelo, do you want to cover this?
Yeah. Well, in the previous slide, I thought it would be interesting to just translate what 10 million means. 10 million means that the government would have to collect $28 for every man, woman, and child to cover the 10 billion that they would be giving to the Postal Service. So, anytime you hear about all of this COVID relief and all of this other stuff, that has, real life implications. Somebody eventually has to pay for that. And so, that's what we're talking about. Go ahead to the next slide, Leo. And so when you look at the last package, which it looks like, other than giving, individual people a stimulus check, most of the other stuff seems to be agreed upon. This is the language from that package that talks about the $10 billion that the Postal Service gets. It basically says that, they get it without strings. It says that the Board of Governors has to present to Congress within 180 days a plan. The Postal Service has been working on their 5 and 10-year plans. This just says that they now have to get it done. And then they have to show, how they're spending that money to the Postal Regulatory Commission. There was a question in the chat box before we.
Yeah, there was a question about the deputy's job. Of course, the deputy PMG is chosen by the board and the PMG. It's a statutory position, so there has to be one. But there's no requirement to have somebody put in that position within X number of days of its becoming vacant. Ron Stroman left in June, I think it was June. On the eve of the arrival of the new PMG. So there's been no one in the job now for, going on 6 months. We would not know what they're thinking. We do not know who they are searching for. They could be going outside. They could be looking inside. We don't know, nor do we therefore have a timeline about when an individual would be selected for the position. I guess what you do know is that it won't be David Williams, neither David Williams, the former governor, nor David Williams, the COO, because David is retiring at the end of the month. So there won't be the usual succession plan when you have different senior executives moving up the ladder into the top jobs. So whether that indicates that there will be somebody else from another position in headquarters, or, like I say, an outsider, stay tuned, and when we know, you'll know, and vice versa. And we could also point out too that, as Angelo was mentioning, the possible grant to the Postal Service that is in one of the current proposals would be different from what was in the original CARES Act back in, I guess, January or something, which reflected the administration's dislike for the Postal Service. As you recall, a comment once made by the president that the Postal Service was a joke, which really did not go over well with the Postal Service, or his criticism of how the Postal Service, set rates for parcels. He made the comment once that unless they quadruple the prices on parcels, they weren't going to get any money, meaning the Treasury would not be allowed to release the loan that was contained in the law. So as months passed, eventually there was an agreement reached between the Treasury and the Postal Service, but it was not one that I would consider to be favorable to the Postal Service's interests. It reflected the bias against the Postal Service and how the administration did not care for how the agency was run. And I think part of that came from the fact that former PMG Megan Brennan did not support the president's position on international mail or on parcels, and that, of course, as we learn, does not endear an individual to the president if they don't agree with him. So, but that's water over the dam pretty much now. Let's see what we got next here on the slide deck. Here we go. Other things to consider. Did I miss one there? Nope. Okay. Other things to consider include a variety of issues that could be in the congressional docket. We always hope springs eternal here for some sort of reform legislation. One thing that popped up going on 2 years ago at the start of the then new Congress, which is almost over now, was the simple elimination of the pre-funding obligation. It was like a 14-word bill that essentially just abolished the requirement. That didn't go, it never got out of the Senate. So that is, of course, dead legislation as far as that's concerned. Whether there will be a review or rationalization of the universal service obligation, we don't know. It certainly would make sense to think about whether what the obligation imposes on the Postal Service is still reasonable and economically sensible nowadays. The presidential task force that was commissioned going on 2 years ago and that reported well over a year ago that probably will not go very far now because of the change of administration. But that report, it's also called for some reconsideration of the postal monopolies and how they and the universal service obligation are tied together, and how those might need to be rethought if the Postal Service is to be a viable enterprise, whether you want to call it a service or a business in the future. The PRC's 10-year review, which we'll talk about in a minute, of course, has now come to a conclusion, and its contents are known. So we'll be discussing those and how they may impact the Postal Service and its customers as well. Cash on hand, that looks like a lot of money, but the Postal Service's biweekly payroll is $2 billion with a B. So they deal in big numbers. They have a lot of money on hand. They spend a lot of money, but they also have enormous debts. Their liabilities are way into, let me think, 9 figures, I guess is the right number. So they may have, a lot of money to bank to you and I, but in their scale of reference, their scale of counting, it's not all that much. Let's see here, the strategic plan. Do you want to cover this, Angelo?
Sure. Yeah. So as far as the Postal Service strategic plan, the Postmaster General did state that they're developing a 5 to 10 year strategic plan, which he does plan to share in the upcoming months. They've been vetting a couple of hundred different initiatives internally. I mean, that's a lot of stuff to pour through. And they did say that, some of that would require regulatory or legislative change to implement. I mean, no different than what we were hearing, from the prior PMG. I don't think she had quite the number of initiatives, but that's a pretty large number. So some of the concepts or tenets include, USPS to operate with more precision. The reason why we bolded that is you're going to hear that word a lot from the Postal Service in the future, that they want to operate with more precision, and that's the thing that the new Postmaster General is bringing and pushing. They did affirm that they do want to maintain 6 days per week delivery and 7 days for parcels in some areas. They want to be self-sustaining. They want to come up with a lot of ideas that grow revenue for them. So I know some of the things they were throwing around was what they could do with local post offices to generate additional revenue and what other things that they can do. We'll have to watch that to see, that none of that it doesn't, go against Title 39 and what they're allowed and not allowed to do. Like banking is one of the things they were talking about doing in local post offices and that. And they have a bunch of ideas around legislation and what they're going to try to push for.
Of course, the interesting thing would be to see how they balance some of the things that they're talking about at the same time. Because efficiency by nature requires the alignment of costs and income. And if you look at a lot of the things the Postal Service does as part of its service mandate, part of universal service obligation, they are not financially rewarding. If 2/3 of your post offices don't generate enough revenue to pay for themselves, if the value of a piece of mail, a postage value, keeps declining, and the sustainability of a growing network of delivery points, which has less mail in it, temporarily setting aside packages for the moment, you have to ask yourself how we can become efficient and self-sustaining without looking at ways to rationalize some of the services that we offer, particularly if you're not getting any kind of, if you don't have any sources of income other than what people pay in postage. And most of what's paid in postage is not coming from average citizens who benefit from these services, but from commercial mailers. So in a lot of ways, the system needs to be rebalanced. I think he's used that term too, in order for it to make financial sense and keep itself operationally successful. Let's see here. The CPI. This goes right to the point about revenue. The chart shows you how the annualized CPI has moved over the past 3 years, And as you can see, it's been going pretty much downhill all the way. Had a couple little uphill ticks, and back in August, when the soon to be implemented rate case was filed, it was at a point that was higher than it is now. So it's been going down pretty steadily and a little more steeply recently. And while the people who have to pay postage may see this as a good thing, it also means that there is less revenue coming into the Postal Service to cover the costs that we expect it to incur to deliver services. So this is part of the problem here when you have an organization operating as a service, but also operating in a way that is supposed to be business-like. If you have a business, you have to make your cost and your income have some rational relationship, but this isn't always the case in the case of the Postal Service. So you've got the biggest problem in that regard manifested recently when the PRC concluded its 10-year review that it started in 2016. And just to make sure that this strange creature is understood, the 2006 postal reform law that changed everything that we knew and how rates were set, that imposed the CPI cap and established all that, also contained 9 objectives and 14 factors that the rate setting process was supposed to meet or satisfy. So the commission has to, was then mandated 10 years later to look at the Postal Service to see if the rate setting process performed as designed and if it was achieving those objectives. Separately, as we all recall, Congress had imposed the pre-funding obligation in the same bill or same law that established the new rate setting process. And there wasn't alignment at the time in, well, how we're going to really support a $5.8 billion obligation every year while keeping rates at the cost of living. So that, of course, became ever more clear as the 10 years went on, so that in their review, the commission had to conclude that the Postal Service was not being kept financially stable by the rate setting process. So if they did all that they could do within their mandate and find ways to fix the process to generate additional revenue. They did not have the statutory authority to go beyond that process and to say, well, it was Congress's idea to impose pre-funding that screwed up the whole balance sheet. It wasn't the inherent flaw in the rate setting process. Just the same, in the final rule that they issued earlier this month, that will take effect next month, they allowed for additional ways for the Postal Service to generate revenue over and above the CPI cap. Angelo, you want to go ahead and cover some of those?
Sure. So within that, there were certain add-ons to the CPI. The first one is density, and I'll actually cover that in a minute. But basically, what density means is that if the Postal Service loses mail volume, they get additional authority to be able to raise rates. And the way that works is the Postal Service, before the end of the year, has to file their annual compliance review. And within that, they put in, through formulas and that, what they think that they're entitled to. The PRC then gets that, vets it, and then puts out their annual compliance determination, or what we call the ACD, which then gives the Postal Service the authority to go ahead and have additional space to be able to raise prices. And that usually happens in the March timeframe. And we'll talk a little bit about what the ramifications around that are. As far as retirement pre-funding, because the Postal Service hasn't been paying for pre-funding, they're allowing them to collect additional dollars to pay for that funding. The caveat there is that if they start asking for it, they have to keep getting it for 5 years, and they have to keep using it. So it's a one-way street. Once you ask for it, which they can if they want to, they'll have to use it. And we'll talk a little bit about percentages. And then there's the 2% for basically products that are underwater. And there's a slightly different formula at the, for class level, you can increase the whole class by an additional 2%. If it's only part of a class, then you have to increase that part of a class 2% above the CPI average for that class. So periodicals, as an example, could see a 2% bump because the whole class is underwater. And then flats, as an example, in marketing mail, would see 2% higher increase than letters. And so that's the way that they would do it. There was also in the original proposal a provision for around productivity and service, but that's been postponed, and that's going to be handled through a separate rate making. The work share pass-throughs were also changed so that the Postal Service has to pass through at least 85% of any savings they get through work share. And so that's now better defined. Also, they put in there some additional reporting requirements because the Postal Service and some of the things that they do aren't quite transparent according to the PRC, and they want a little bit better reporting to see where the Postal Service is spending their money. And all they did was codify basically a practice that's been going on for some time, which is they have to give a 90-day notice when they're going to raise prices. All right, next.
Oh, before we leave that, I want to point out that on that 2% for non-compensatory products, in earlier versions of the proposal of their changes, it had been a requirement that you had to raise the prices 2% over CPI for those products. In the final rule, it was made optional. Yep. So it's kind of ironic that because this is probably aimed mostly at periodicals, which are something in the order of 60 to 70% cost coverage, that they would actually allow the Postal Service to mitigate any kind of or moderate any kind of rate increase for that class of mail, and it wouldn't have any hope of moving it towards better cost coverage.
Yeah, and then the one other bullet that's not in there is the ability to bank some of this authority. Although, based on some comments that the Postmaster General made this week, it looks like that they will try to take advantage of any authority that they have as soon as they have it. So this is a chart that was partly put into the PRC document, and then part of it, which is just a calculation based on just some industry putting their heads together and doing some back of the envelope calculations. So the density authority from 2013 through 2019, you could see what the number is. And that's what, if they had that authority in those years, that's how much more they would be able to raise prices. In 2020, because of COVID and the large decline, people are thinking that it's going to be somewhere in the 4.5 to 4.6 range is the authority that they'll be given in 2021 to be able to raise prices. So let's go to the next slide, Leo, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means. So, what's the bottom line? People ask us that all the time. So what you could see is, you could see a 4.6% density once the ACR and ACD are done, of course, and we see what the actual numbers are. You could see another 2% for underwater products like flats. They could implement 1%, because that's about what it's been averaging, is based on the formulas of what they are able to ask for the retirement obligations. And if they file this thing around mid-year, they could probably get about another 0.6% CPI. And so you add all that up, and in June, July, we might be seeing another price filing with a pretty substantial increase, depending upon whether you're a flat or you're not a flat, and depending upon whether the Postal Service decides to collect for the retiree payment obligations or not, and exactly where CPI will be. So it'll be real interesting to see what happens. Now, as I said, it could happen somewhere in the summer of next year. It is subject to, a stay order and any kind of litigation. The PMG did state that he wants to implement it right after March as soon as he can. I will, just as a kind of a public service announcement around stay and litigation, I think it's important for industry to make sure that they're working with their associations and individually, especially if they're contemplating filing any type of litigation. And I think really the first thing which should happen very quickly, like within the next week or so, is to petition the courts for kind of expedited treatment of this case. The reason why I say that is if that doesn't happen and this thing is going through the courts, the Postal Service will get the authority to raise rates. And, once this is litigated, and just for argument's sake, let's say that, the PRC and the Postal Service lose and they have to pull back some of these prices, they're not going to give rebates for any of this. So if anybody's interested in, any type of litigation, I think that would be the first step, and that should take place pretty quickly. Now, as I said before on the previous slide, there's additional rulemakings that are going to follow around productivity and service performance. All right, next slide, Leo.
Well, before we leave, I just want to mention that early along in this process, probably 3 years ago, when the PRC first issued a proposal to implement something after its review, there was a lot of question about the PRC's authority to change the rate setting process as they have proposed to do. And at that time, they issued, as part of their announcement against their proposed rule, a lengthy discourse on how they believe they had the authority to change the CPI process as they later proposed and as they have now done. So if there is litigation, some of it may well challenge the legitimacy of the PRC's actions under the authority they're given by the statute. So who knows where this could go. But looking over other stuff going on in 2021, there is a world beyond the PRC and rulemaking and rate making, and some things that are going to be of consequence to commercial mail producers, even other than prices. Privacy laws. California in the past election passed an enhanced version of its Consumer Privacy Act that it had already passed a few years ago. And we're still waiting to see how that rolls out in regulation, but other states that were copying or planning to copy California may well now renew those activities. And those may have a bearing on how commercial mail producers collect or retain or manage information about mail recipients. If you do fulfillment activities, if you do data processing, if you do just mailings, you may have requirements about how you manage those things such as address files and records that are retained on behalf of a client. We've also got a lot of activity gurgling up on use taxes. Use taxes being somewhat different than sales taxes because they're imposed by the jurisdiction of destination of a mail piece, and some states, Wisconsin being one of them, is becoming very aggressive in contacting commercial mail producers and asking them to pay a use tax for mail volume that was sent into that state. Of course, the way that the use tax rules usually work is that the mailer is obligated to collect and remit tax from the client. And at this point, there's been a lot of reluctance to do so because, first of all, there's a lot of ambiguity about what the law requires. There's a lot of variation from state to state about both the prices and the conditions and the thresholds at which the obligation takes effect. There's also a lot of concern because you don't want to be the first person to impose this tax or collect this tax, because the client whose business you are competing for is believed to just simply take it and go someplace else where the mail producer is not collecting these taxes. Well, that thinking may have a certain short-term value, but in the long run, as states become more interested in making sure taxes are collected, and as the enforcement of these requirements becomes broader, this perceived competitive disadvantage will go away. And worse, you may have some states collecting back taxes and penalties on those states on those mailers rather, commercial mail producers who did not do what they're supposed to do earlier along in the process. So that's something that is going to be should be of concern to all commercial mail producers next year, or even right now. Then you've got things going on in the international arena. You've got self-declared rates taking effect as we go along here. Some changes happening still in the future and this year as this process expands. You've got the STOP Act, which was meant to impede the flow of illegal substances into the U.S. The Postal Service is a little behind the curve on getting that implemented. So it may have some cost consequence on the Postal Service as it begins to do what it needs to do to enforce the law. There is the larger question about what's going to happen to mail volume. And I'm saying mail as opposed to parcels. Letters and flats, first class, periodicals, and marketing mail. How much of that is going to come back, if it ever comes back? When will it come back? In what form? Will people, businesses whose commercial activities were severely depressed by the pandemic return to the mail? Will they look for less expensive, though arguably less efficient modes of advertising? How will this affect the viability of commercial mail producers going into 2021? How much parcel volume will be retained by the Postal Service? And this may be something which some folks see as a nuisance because it jams up processing centers and slows down the movement of letters and flats, takes up space in delivery vehicles, but it also helps to pay the bills. So whatever parcel volume the Postal Service got over the past several months since last spring turned their forecast from an ocean of red ink into a situation where they actually made money a couple of months, much to everyone's surprise. So to the extent that parcel volume brings in urgently needed revenue to the Postal Service, it's something which we should all be interested in seeing continue, even if it has some disruptive effect on a mail system that is usually geared towards handling letters and flats. So I think with that, we have probably
I think we have two quick questions, and then we'll run out of time. So the first question was, expanding a little bit about, how the Postal Service is going to be self-sustaining given, the 1 billion per year impact around, employee wages going up and the expenses and things of that nature. And that's I think really why the PRC put in that density adder in there to give the Postal Service additional authority so that as volume decline, that they're able to get more money. But you're also going to see volume declines accelerate as a result of that as well. So hopefully we don't get into the what people called for many years the death spiral.
This is something that I kind of took a pot shot at in the last issue of the newsletter, because to me it's not realistic for an organization that is losing money, losing volume, to continue to offer the same wage increases and same contract terms that it's agreed to for 30 years, 40 years. But nobody in labor relations in postal headquarters or in the unions seem to be interested in recognizing the fact that the world has changed and that they're going to have to begin considering a little more moderation of what is expected out of labor contracts year over year. But I think if that's such a comment, though, I think sometimes is interpreted as being hostile to unions or labor, which isn't meant to be the case at all. It's simply a reflection of the fact the Postal Service is not financially solid, and its business activity is changing radically, and that everybody who's in the boat needs to realize this, because everybody who's in it will go down together on a boat. They won't go down just one at a time. So but the comment is well taken, that it's not rational to face losses that they're facing while at the same time business as usual in some of these contracts. And the last question was, where can we get more information on sales tax? We provide that information regularly to our subscribers. We have a law firm that we have on a retainer to help our subscribers. So that's the best answer I can give you. It's a very complex issue. It's 50 states, and they all seem to have different answers. So it's something which is a separate webinar of its own, which we will be doing next year. Mr. Stroman's transitional role. Ron is he's on a committee of 4 leading the Biden administration's transition team on postal issues. Beyond that, I don't know what he's doing. I think he joined a private firm after he left the Postal Service, and I believe he's still there, happily enjoying not having to deal with what he had to deal with back at L'Enfant Plaza.
Yep.
With that, Angelo?
Yeah, just pop up the last slide and we'll just say goodbye.
Okay, let's see here. The last slide. Whoop, that ain't it. That
was it.
That was it. That was it. Yep.
Okay, so thanks everybody for joining. And as Leo said earlier, this recording will be available as well as the slides for anybody that needs it. And thank you for attending.
Yes, thank you very much, folks. We'll have a webinar next in January next, and we'll keep you posted on that. I look forward to seeing you then. Thanks again for calling in today. Thanks to Michelle for being in the background. Thank you to Angelo and to Grayhair for supporting us. We'll talk to you again soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.